Hello, everyone. This is The Sexual Catholic, and I'm your host, Dr. Mark Levand. If you're interested in broadening your understanding of sexuality and/or the sexuality-Catholicism connection, you're in the right place. Thanks for being here today. Let's get into the episode. All right. Hello and welcome to this episode of The Sexual Catholic. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Levand, and in this episode, we're going to talk about sexual shame. What is it? How does it come about? And what can it do to our experience of sexuality? And then we'll look at what rejoicing in our sexuality might look like, also called sexual joy, so we can try our best to live as sexually integrated people in the world today. And a quick heads up, we will talk briefly about sexual trauma in this episode. So if you think you might not be in a space to listen to conversations about that, feel free to turn it off and then return at a later time. So before we get into sexual shame today, I want to thank all you listeners out there who were giving me helpful feedback. Some people I know and trust were like, hey, Mark, podcast is super informative and it's kind of dry. And for that, I apologize. They're not entirely wrong. The first couple episodes are getting a good deal of thought and theory out of the way so that we can get into some more practical applications in future episodes. For example, we will discuss things like intimate partner relationships and sexual communication, sexual trauma and abuse, sexual decision-making, sexual orientation and gender identity, and more, depending on how this season of the podcast goes. I may also bring on guests who kind of have their own experiences of Catholicism, or maybe expert theologians or sexuality professionals. I don't know, but thank you all for the feedback. I will try to tell a couple more personal stories to make these next couple episodes a little more engaging, while also including helpful information. And as always, please, if you have feedback or thoughts for topics on future episodes, please visit thesexualcatholic.com, where you can find a contact page, or send some ideas to thesexualcatholic@gmail.com. Okay, so sexual shame. Let's completely solve this in under an hour on this episode right here. I would love a world where people feel joy and comfort in their bodies and with their sexuality all the time. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. And in fact, sometimes is not at all the case. And we can't solve it, unfortunately, right now. But we are going to at least take a bite out of the situation, so to speak. Okay, so let's talk about sexual shame. Whenever people talk about sexuality in Catholicism, it's oftentimes about sexual shame. I think I mentioned this in an earlier episode, but when I tell people that I work on sexuality in Catholicism, they say that those are contradictory, those can't go together. Often people tell me stories about being shamed by Catholics, either growing up or even as adults. Well, let's tackle this concept early on here so we can get to better understandings about sexuality. Sexual shame is contrary to Catholic theology. But Mark, you might say, I have heard this time and time again from father, sister, grandma, mom, dad, parents, guardians, the media, that Catholicism supplies tons of sexual shame and guilt. And you would not be wrong. And also, what individual people say that instills shame is a misuse of Catholic theology. There's a sexual ethicist named Mark Jordan, and in a chapter that he wrote for an edited book titled Love and Christian Ethics, he says, quote, "In rearing their young, Christian families mix churchly lessons with prejudices about honor and shame, discipline and indulgence, thrift and waste." End quote. And that's what we're going to talk about today. When we mix church lessons with our own prejudices about honor and shame, we might create an environment that gives a deep and lasting shame about our bodies, the bodies that God created. I started this podcast because so many medical doctors and therapists kept reaching out to me and saying, Mark, what sex-positive Catholic resources exist out there? Where can we send our patients and clients who are experiencing such shame or harm from their Catholic upbringing? And the answers were not all that super. There are some great books on theology and history out there, like Salzman and Lawler's book, The Sexual Person, or Margaret Farley's book, Just Love. But those are kind of dense and heady for an average reader. Same with some really great perspectives about sexual ethics from Patricia Beatty Jung or Brian Massengale or Susan Ross or Christine Gudorf, M. Sean Copeland, and so many others. There's so many great books by spiritual writers that discuss the value of our sexuality, like Miguel de la Torre or James Allison, James Nelson, or Ronald Rollheiser. But sometimes they'll use language or imagery that can end up accidentally reinforcing shame rather than alleviating it. And trust me, there's so many people in the world today, Catholic or otherwise, who are really invested in people feeling shame about their sexuality. I can only guess what their reasons are, but one thing I can say from my years as an educator reading journal assignments about sexuality is that sometimes people need to know that other people experience shame so they can make sense of their own shame around sexuality. Sometimes people need to know that other people experience shame so they can make sense of their own shame around sexuality. This is the beauty of sharing about our experiences in class or group therapy or with a group of friends on things like this. But some people feel like they need to instill shame in others so that they can make sure others experience shame, which helps them make sense of their own shame. So when I teach my human sexuality courses to college students, we often have journal assignments where they reflect on the content in class. After one class on sexual shame, a Catholic student wrote about it in their journal. They said that growing up, they would just hear their parents shame their siblings about it, yelling at them for saying or even insinuating anything about nakedness. They got shamed for the same reasons by their parents. Whenever talking about sex, sexuality, genitals, or even the orientation of others, the parents would yell at them. They'd say, "That's inappropriate. Stop talking about those things." And the student, in turn, thought that's just how you talk about sexuality. And so they shamed their friends. They would tell on their friends for asking questions about this kind of stuff. They said that they were shamed so much about their sexuality growing up that they thought communicating shame was just how you were supposed to talk about sex. Enforcing shame wasn't a particularly bad thing. It didn't stand out as unusual for them, but just normal and expected, thinking that's just how you should talk about sex, is with shame. And so the students said that it was mind-blowing to them to find out that other people were allowed to ask questions and were not shamed by teachers and parents. Sometimes, and more often than I'd like, my college courses or workshops that I do for adult learners is the first time anyone has ever told them that it's okay to talk about sex and sexuality. This is not just my experience either. Every sexuality educator I know has this experience when teaching adults. So, if this is the first time you're hearing it, learning about sexuality is not inappropriate. As I said in the last episode on sexuality education, asking about and learning about sexuality in educational settings is very appropriate. Thank you for taking care of yourself through curiosity and self-exploration in learning about sexuality. Again, thank you for taking care of yourself through your curiosity and self-exploration in learning about sexuality. But in Catholic settings, it's hard to talk about sexual shame. There are traditions in the Catholic world of embracing sexual shame, sometimes calling it healthy. Sometimes there's a narrative that sexual shame prevents us from doing quote-unquote bad things with our sexuality. These attitudes on sexual shame have guided some of the more traditionalist views of sexual theology today. And while there's a lot more to the story, In this episode, let's start here. When we know how to value ourselves and our sexuality while keeping in right relationship, sexual shame can prevent us from living truly integrated sexual lives. Again, when we know how to value ourselves and our sexuality while keeping in right relationship, sexual shame can prevent us from living truly integrated sexual lives. In other words, sexual shame is often a barrier to us accepting ourselves and being the best sexual people we can be. How do we know this? Because it's written in our fundamental theology about bodies. Because shame about a body that is created by God is contrary to Catholic teaching. Look at the creation story. Once Adam and Eve knew they were naked, they hid in shame. That's not how God created them. Shame is literally contrary to how we are made as sexual beings. We are called to have bodies in awesome ways, and anytime someone wants to say that Jesus would be unhappy or dish out shame, remember the story of the woman caught in adultery. Mark Jordan, remember that sexual ethicist I mentioned earlier, points to this story. It's John 8, 1-11, I think. Jesus says that he will not enact the codes of shame that are expected of someone in his position, literally bucking against the system set up to enforce shame, truly counter to the culture. The concept of rebuking sexual shame is also seen in the world of sexology. We see people doing this in therapeutic settings. There are books like Sex, God, and the Conservative Church, or Advancing Sexual Health for the Christian Client, where we see people take shame seriously in Christian settings and help clinicians understand how to help people through those feelings of sexual shame. So, when people think sexual shame is synonymous with Catholicism, remind them that, based in a gospel of love, rejoicing in our bodies is firmly grounded in a theology of right relationship with ourselves, and is much better than feeling shame about those bodies. Well, Mark, you might say, easier said than done. Too true. It's not always an easy task. But if we can unlearn the shame that has been instilled in us about our bodies from years of observation or being scolded or whatever, we can get a little closer to knowing about ourselves in the way God made us. Sexual shame is, of course, multifaceted, or it has many different components to it. And we can't go into every aspect of it in this short episode. But I want to name here that being yelled at or shamed by others is not the only way we might develop sexual shame. Sexual shame can also be a response to sexual trauma. Whenever people experience violation in some way, they may hold shame about it. That, if you'd fallen for a scam, people may have shame about that because they were violated, that their trust was violated. It was an all-around not good experience. And not that sexual violation is the same way, but this shame can also happen with sexual violation. Sometimes, if someone experiences a traumatic sexual event, they might learn that avoiding sexuality and not talking about sexuality is the much safer route. So in this way, sexual shame can be a protective factor. Sometimes these instances, the concepts of sexuality and quote-unquote bad things, become intertwined, immediately associating anything sexual with badness and a subsequent feeling of shame. We will do an episode about sexual trauma later in the series, but for now, let's just name this. In instances of sexual trauma, a person who is violated or harmed may have a raised sensitivity for the need to feel safe. And sometimes, if feelings of shame can prevent feelings of danger, then it's important to do what you need to do to feel safe, as long as it doesn't harm others. What we know is that sexual trauma can cause rifts or harm. And that is most certainly not right relationship. That is the opposite of what Catholic theology teaches us. Anything that causes harm to rift those relationships, bad. Things that join, create harmony, heal relationships, good. This is one of the guiding premises of this podcast. When undoing some of the intricate connections that we have formed over the years about sex and shame, it would be helpful to talk with a trained professional who specializes in sexual shame. As an advocate for therapy, I think everyone should do this. You get a therapist. You get a therapist. We all should get good therapists. It's really helpful because a lot of us aren't taught how to identify our feelings, identify things going on in our lives that maybe we are enacting consciously or unconsciously. Because it's helpful to have someone there to discuss these things with when we're unraveling our understanding of sexual shame. It's helpful to have an outside person help us think through those inside thoughts. There are various ways of understanding shame in clinical settings. That shame has a particular function, that we adapt our shame response to better socialize ourselves or get along with people, that shame is rooted in our attachment styles, etc., whatever. All of these will inform how your therapist understands and deals with shame in a therapeutic setting. But when it comes to sexual shame, overcoming it will almost always start with naming it. If you feel shame, what about? This is why group settings like classes or group therapy can feel so comforting here. Being able to share your story and hear the stories of others can really help us not feel so alone. And aloneness or isolation is a key breeding ground for sexual shame. If you've ever seen the adult cartoon Big Mouth, they do a good job of depicting this with the shame wizard, the anthropomorphized version of shame, who tries to isolate the main characters to get them to feel even more shame, as I tap my fingers together like Mr. Burns. It's a funny show, of course, not without its critiques, but, moving on. Okay. So, once we can name the shame that we feel and understand what purpose that shame is serving for us, we can compare it to our understanding of how God created humans and what role that shame plays in us being sexually whole. Do we experience shame about our bodies just being bodies? Shame about our sexual orientations or sexual interests? Shame in how we might feel hurt or vulnerable around topics of sexuality? And what purpose does that serve? Does it protect us from further ridicule or protect us from having to confront some deeper feelings that we're trying to avoid? Perhaps the shame is related to our feelings of self-worth. Whatever the nature of sexual shame in our lives, an important question is, does this help me become more sexually whole? Or does it harm my relationship with myself, my body, others, or God? I said earlier on in this episode that future episodes may involve bringing people on to talk about this stuff. And I think it would be good to include people's stories about sexual shame. Whenever I tell people about the podcast and they're like, oh my gosh, you should have people on. I could come on your podcast and talk about blank. Usually that thing that they add that fills in the blank is a story of sexual shame. Because people want others to know that there is a way to overcome that. There's a way to be on the other side feeling not shamed about our bodies and sexuality. This is because so much of the work that I do around sexuality has to do with listening to people's stories and listening to how people feel supported and not so alone when they hear other stories of people healing around sexual shame. So, how do we address sexual shame? How can we get rid of it? Well, everyone is on their own individual journey for figuring this out. I'm not a therapist, but I know that as an educator and as a person who helps other people, what might help would be setting a goal. What would you like to have instead of sexual shame? In many cases, people discuss sexual joy or rejoicing in our sexuality as a more fulfilling alternative. Sexual joy involves gratitude for our bodies. When we eat, we might feel satiated and can enjoy the taste of food or feeling full or having the energy our body needs. When we touch our bodies, we can have gratitude for the way our nerve endings fire to our brain, letting us feel. This includes sexual pleasure too. I remember reading a reflection of an older man, maybe in his 60s or 80s, reflecting on this. I forget the source. Perhaps some book of poems or accounts of embodiment. But the reflection goes something like this. He discusses being in the bathtub, and suddenly it dawning on him how he has not appreciated his body. In his older age, he was feeling angry and resentful that his body was changing, making it harder to do the things he loved doing. Joints hurting, fatigue setting in, at times erectile difficulties, or back pain. And he was reflecting on what gratitude he could offer. It was at this point he did a reframe or took a different frame of mind. He recognized that this very body he was in carried him throughout his whole life. He reflected on how he could experience this world, in one sense, only through his body. If I ever find that passage, maybe I'll read some excerpts here, but he goes on to touch his body in tender ways, thanking the various parts for the roles they played in letting him experience the world, thanking his hands for all the things they did over the years, his legs, his knees, his genitals, his eyes, his neck, recalling some of the fun times they've been through together. It can be a really meaningful exercise for some people. We will also do some episodes on aging and sexual development and sex and disabilities later on. But I think this story brings an important truth to our discussion of sexual joy. If we can reflect on our bodies in ways that offer gratitude and give thanks to God for giving us bodies, with all the faculties it has, including its sexual functioning and sexual pleasure, it might make accessing sexual joy just a little bit easier. Both the Catholic Church and sexologists say that we should do a better job of focusing on joys and positivity around sexuality. We just heard Pope Francis reiterate that in the new documentary. I think the English title is The Pope: Answers, saying that, sex is one of the beautiful things God gave to human beings. In my life, as a sexuality educator and researcher, I do my best to understand how shame works in our lives. And because education is a human service profession, or a helping profession, my colleagues and I try to lay an educational foundation for people to learn more about sexuality and hopefully address some of the shame that may be holding them back from living more fulfilling sexual lives. And one aspect of sexuality that people might feel shame about is sexual behavior. Tune in next time for a look into sexual decision-making and some helpful input from the cutting edges of theology that can help us live as sexually conscientious adults. Thank you all for listening to this episode. If you liked what you heard or otherwise appreciated it, please subscribe and rate the podcast. If you have other thoughts or ideas for future episodes you'd like to share, please email thesexualcatholic@gmail.com. If you or someone you know would like to learn more about the work that I do, for more information, please visit www.marklevand.com. Thank you for tuning in. I hope something in today's episode was helpful, interesting, or otherwise inspiring. Have a great day.